Welcome back to my channel, where I'm laying out the history of everything, and in this video we're going to consider the history of the Persian Empire from the start of Xerxes I's reign in 486 BC up until around 400 BC, or early into the reign of Artaxerxes II, when he faced off against his revolting brother Cyrus. Revolting in the rebellion sense, and doesn't refer to Cyrus's personality, which Xenophon would assure you was pristine. Darius, the prior king, died in 486 BC, some years after having seen his forces humiliated at Marathon, and less than a year after Egypt entered into rebellion. Darius' son and chosen successor, Xerxes, now assumed the kingship of the Persian Empire. He first turned to Egypt to put down that rebellion, and subsequently he continued in his father's aim, pivoting towards Greece to show Athens who was boss. First off, Xerxes turned to the rebellion in Egypt in 485 BC, throttled the rebellion, and left his brother Achaemenid in charge over Egypt. Xerxes quickly found Babylon in rebellion, and he had soon ended that rebellion as well, lessened Babylonian autonomy from there on, and removed the title King of Babylon from his titulature. In 483 BC, he began organizing and working on the coming invasion of Greece. In the last battle against Athens, Darius had sent perhaps as much as 15,000 soldiers who traversed the Aegean and lost soundly. This time, Xerxes would muster up far more forces, and while estimates vary, I'm going to run with the estimate given by Professor John Lee. The forces included some 80,000 infantry, along with a further 10,000 cavalry. This was too much to bring across by sea, and this time he sent his forces by land to be accompanied by sea with a naval force of triremes hugging the coast of the Aegean, making their way alongside the inland marching army. There were perhaps 500 of these triremes, and they were somewhat lighter and faster than their counterparts on the Greek side of things. This wasn't the first time Persian forces made their way across land into northern Greece, as under Darius, Mardonius had been sent there and had successfully brought Macedon into the Persian Empire. The invasion itself wouldn't start until 480 BC, but already in 481 troops were gathering and drilling at Sardis, and even earlier, in 483, preparations for the invasion were underway. You may recall that under Darius, Mardonius had lost a great portion of his fleet in a storm while rounding the Athos Peninsula cliffs. To avoid that, and also to open up cross-seasonal trans-Aegean access to the Greek mainland for when Persia would soon rule there, 483 BC saw Xerxes start the construction of a more than mile-long, 100 feet across and 10 feet deep canal built through the isthmus of the Athos Peninsula. Herodotus contends that pride was the reason for this, as in his mind, quote, with no trouble they could have drawn their ships across the isthmus, unquote. Further construction efforts were made at the Dardanelles, or the Hellespont, a narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. Over there he had constructed 2 pontoon bridges, which his army used to enter Thrace and then make their way west, building further roads and bridges along the way. Herodotus claims that something rather comical ensued when the initial bridge-building attempt failed, and Xerxes had fetters thrown into the water and had the water whipped 300 times. This apparently worked, as the next attempt at bridge-building succeeded. Along the way west, numerous provision stations helped sustain the traveling army. Another step taken by Xerxes was to send ahead messengers to the Greek cities requesting offerings of earth and water, a way of expressing loyalty to the Persian king. Sparta and Athens, having earlier under Darius thrown the messengers that he sent asking for their submission in this way into a pit, now weren't offered the luxury of submission. They would be facing war. Not all of the messengers that Xerxes sent out requesting earth and water returned empty-handed. After spending the winter drilling, Xerxes and the army set out from Sardis in spring of 480 BC, over the bridges, through Thrace, into Macedonia, and down through Thessaly. The Persian fleet mirrored this route along the coast. Thessaly and Thebes supported the Persian effort, and an allied Greek effort dominated by Athens and Sparta now came forth to oppose the invaders and their nearby allies. To obviate the advantages of numbers the Persians had, the Athens-Sparta-led alliance moved north to block the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Xerxes' swift advance surprised the Greeks, who were in the truce period induced by the ongoing Olympic Games, and Sparta, who'd previously declined to help the Athenians at Marathon due to the festival that they were celebrating. This time, despite being in the middle of the festival of Carnea, they sent a slight preliminary force of King Leonidas with 300 men, while the other Greeks who could make it to Thermopylae only brought the total to around 7,000. While the allied Greeks on land came to block Thermopylae, the Greek fleet, which was overwhelmingly Athenian, moved to another narrow juncture that the Persians would have to pass through, this time the Persian fleet. Namely, they moved to block the Strait of Artemisium, which you had to go through to avoid the unsafe waters along the east of Euboea. The allied Greek army fought against the Persian army at this narrow juncture of Thermopylae for a couple of days, and Xerxes sent elite troops through a path in the mountains to outflank them and attack them from both sides. When Leonidas found out about the Persians making their way through the mountains, he dismissed most of the allied army, and he and the remaining forces were soon faced by Persians from front and back, whom they fought until all of them were killed off, and the Persians continued their way south towards Athens. Meanwhile, concurrent with this battle, the Persian and Greek fleets vied at Artemisium. Serious damage was wrought on both sides, and after receiving word that Thermopylae had fallen, the Athenian-dominated fleet retreated southward, where they aided in evacuating the people of Athens to Salamis and remained around Salamis. Not everyone evacuated Athens, however, and the few who remained defended the Acropolis. Xerxes entered Athens in 480, and after defeating the Acropolis defenders, had the city set to flames. Now, he turned to the Greek fleet right off the coast of Salamis. The Persian fleet cluttered into the waters near Salamis, and battle ensued in September 480 BC. The extended string of Persian success in this campaign came to an end here, and the Greeks defeated the Persians soundly. After this, the Persians retreated, with Xerxes and much of the army leaving entirely, making their way back over land to Sardis. Remaining in Greece, though giving up Athens and basing themselves out of Thebes, was Mardonius and the many soldiers left under his authority. After the winter of 480 through 479 BC, the Persians under Mardonius attacked Athens again. Mardonius then attempted to negotiate with those at Salamis, but they turned to the Spartans for help. Mardonius then retreated to near Plataea, where the allied Greeks pursued them. After numerous battles over a couple of weeks, Mardonius and the Persians undermined the food and drink supply of the Greeks and then attacked. But Mardonius soon fell, and the Persians fled, making the long trek back to Sardis, the very place the Athenians had joined the Ionians in attacking all those years back that got this whole story rolling. While the Persians under Mardonius were engaging in their last direct threat to mainland Greece, the allied Greeks were attacking the Persian coast. The Athenian-led fleet had made their way across the Aegean and attacked Mycale, defeating a force there and burning many ships. Then the three islands of Samos, Chios, and Lesbos rebelled. 478 BC saw the founding of an alliance of Greek city-states called the Delian League, and over the coming decades they would gnaw at the western front of the Persian Empire, expelling the Persians from Macedon, Thrace, the Aegean Islands, and Ionia. The League got its name from the place where the alliance was agreed to, the island of Delos. The need for a new alliance had arisen when Sparta removed itself from the conflict with Persia, which from their perspective was over. Persia would make one last effort some years later, and that would be thwarted when shortly after 470 BC, the Persians began to build up a fleet of ships and sending them over to Eurymedon to meet up with the Persian army. Cimon, an Athenian general, set out to attack before Persian reinforcements from Cyprus could arrive. They breached the line of the Persian fleet, and the fleet sought refuge with the army. Cimon and his troops went ashore and defeated the Persians there too. the Persians wouldn't make a similar attempt again, and shortly thereafter, Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BC. Before moving on from Xerxes, you'll remember that once the Persian fleet lost at Salamis, Xerxes headed back to Persia and never returned to Greece. Instead, he left Mardonius in charge of the troops in Greece. Xerxes, meanwhile, with his time now freed from war, dedicated himself to building projects. He finished a number of projects started by his father Darius and had constructed projects of his own. He continued work on Darius's palace at Susa. Darius had also started the Apadana in Persepolis, and Xerxes now completed that. He further completed the Persepolis palace of Darius, the Takara, and also at Persepolis, Xerxes had a much larger palace built for himself, the Hadish. The Gate of All Nations at Persepolis is yet another thing he had built. Lastly, if you watched my previous video, you'll remember the Byzantine inscription by Darius, which I fixated on there. It turns out that Darius had smoothed out another rock face, but much smaller, and he hadn't filled it out. So Xerxes now filled it. This one too is in Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite, but it's much shorter than the Byzantine one and comes with no accompanying art. In the inscription, we can see a transition from how Darius described the god Ahura Mazda, who he referred to as a great god, to the higher place Xerxes has for him, as the inscription reads, quote, "A great god is Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, created happiness for man, and made Xerxes king," unquote. Ahura Mazda seems to have graduated to being superior to even the other great gods. It's not entirely clear who killed Xerxes, but the next king was Artaxerxes I, whose name in the Persian means he who holds power through truth. Following Ctesias, but just for the sake of filling in this gap with a story we'll tentatively follow, the way this happened was the high official Artabanus brought about the killing of Xerxes, had it pinned on Darius, who Artaxerxes killed, before Artaxerxes realized the truth and killed Artabanus. Artaxerxes I put down a rebellion in Bactria before another rebellion broke out in the southwest of his empire, perhaps in 463 BC, when Achaemenes faced a revolt by Inaros in Egypt. Inaros asked for and got help from the Athenians. Things started badly for Persia, with Inaros defeating Achaemenes and his forces, and the Persian forces retreating to Memphis without their now killed leader, Achaemenes. The Athenians and Egyptians now settled into a siege of Memphis. 460 BC had Xerxes send the Persian army to Egypt under Megabyzus and Artabazus, and they defeated the Athenians and chased them down to the island of Persepolis, and this time it was the Persians doing the besieging, which lasted some 18 months before Athenian surrender in 457 BC. Around 450 BC, after one last failed attempt by Athens against Persia through besieging Kishan of Cyprus as well as aiding holdout Egyptian rebels, Athens and Persia may have entered into an agreement in which Athens controlled the Ionian cities and Athens wouldn't send forces into the Persian Empire so long as the Persians didn't cross specific boundaries in the other direction with their own forces. This marks a significant transition in the relationship between the two powers. Artaxerxes I finished the Hall of 100 Columns started by his father, which was located next to the Apadana Palace, which itself saw significant fire damage under Artaxerxes' reign, to which Artaxerxes began the efforts of repairing. Artaxerxes is described in the Bible as having commissioned Ezra and Nehemiah to regulate the Jewish nation. Artaxerxes I died in 424 BC, and his son and successor Xerxes II followed him. After ruling for 45 days, a half-brother of Xerxes, Sogdianus, assassinated him. Another brother, Ochus, then serving as satrap of Hyrcania, killed Sogdianus after a perhaps around half-year reign on Sogdianus' part. Ochus changed his name and arrives to us as Darius II. Under Darius II, the situation in Greece shifted, lending itself to Persian involvement. Athens had supported a revolt by Amorges and Caria, and had embarked on their Sicilian expedition, which ended terribly for them. Darius now ordered the satrap Tissaphernes of Sardis and the satrap Pharnabazus of Daskyleon to enact an anti-Athens agenda, re-establishing Persian control over many of the Ionian Greek cities, and entering into an alliance with Sparta against Athens and sending them money. The alliance continued, even strengthened, after Darius replaced the Sardis satrap Tissaphernes with his 16-year-old son Cyrus in 407 BC. Cyrus now became the Koronos of the western satrapies. This means that he was the top satrap, or the satrap of satraps, if you will, in the region. Cyrus befriended the Spartan commander Lysander, who would bring an end to the war against Athens in favor of Sparta in 404 BC. Darius died in 405 or perhaps early 404 BC and left the kingship to his son Arsaces, known by his kingly title Artaxerxes or Artaxerxes II to us. We'll leave most of the reign of Artaxerxes II to another day, but for now we'll consider the period early in his reign, near the end of the century. Egypt rebelled early in Artaxerxes II's reign in 404 BC, and Artaxerxes sent a general to contend with the rebellion, but he'd be called back because of a more major rebellion elsewhere. For that, we have to go back to Sardis and turn to Artaxerxes' brother Cyrus, who was drilling the many soldiers under his rule as Koronos, perhaps 20,000, as well as some 12,000 mercenaries he'd hired for his mission. He lied to the troops, presenting the mission they were setting out on as an effort against the raiding Pisidians of the mountains. Cyrus's army began marching in 401 BC. Along the way, the troops became increasingly restive as it became clear that the Pisidians were not their actual target, and eventually they were told the truth of their mission at Thapsacus. They were heading to Babylon, which is where Artaxerxes, informed by Tissaphernes of Cyrus's plans, made his way to defend his claim to the empire. Tissaphernes himself served as a general for him. The battle finally came just some 70 kilometers north of Babylon, near Cunaxa. After the start of battle saw a falling out of ideality in the formation of Cyrus's forces, Cyrus led a direct charge at Artaxerxes, which ended with the death of Cyrus by javelin. After a tense period, the mercenaries, finding themselves in hostile territory and their leaders killed through a malicious meet and greet with Tissaphernes, elected new leaders and made a march back home upland. One of these 5 new leaders they chose is the famed Xenophon, whose Anabasis tells us this in his story. Xenophon himself returned to bad news. Having left Athens earlier due to his distaste for democracy, he now returned to the news that his mentor Socrates had been executed. On the other side of things was another Greek who had set much to writing, namely the personal physician of Artaxerxes, who treated the wound he received in battle, the gossip-gabbing Ctesias. We now leave this story around 400 BC, with Artaxerxes II having put down the threat from his brother Cyrus, although the Egyptian rebellion remained, and in fact would linger throughout the rest of his reign. The Persian Empire itself wouldn't survive the coming 100 years, and we'll learn all about that in the coming video.